We live? Looks like we are. Hey everybody, how's everybody this morning? This is DeWayne Carron. I'm an educator here at Gamble, and we want to welcome you to another Facebook Live here, coming from our storage room here in New Melly, Missouri, where we have a wicked storm going on. So what I wanted to do today was share my screen with you guys, and we're going to still try and do that today, but we're going to use the phone because our internet Wi-Fi is pretty unstable this morning. So we're going to hang around for a little bit. Hey Leanne, and Deanne's here. Cool. It's coming in sideways. I might turn my head a little bit so I can read, because everything's coming in sideways on the phone. So we're going to hang around for a little bit and let some people hop on. Rebecca. Very cool. So I thought what we would do today is we would talk about needles, and primarily about needles that we use on our long arm machine. Boy, there's a lot of people on already. Very cool. We'll hang around for another minute before we get started here. Good morning, everybody. Jody from Memphis. I guess it's morning for most people. I guess if you're in the, well, there's David Redding. It's probably about, I'm guessing 4 or 5 o'clock in the UK, depending on where he is. For you Aussies, I don't even know why you're still awake. It's got to be 3 o'clock in the morning there. And Debbie from Kentucky. Well, very cool. Well, we want to welcome you guys. We have a lot of fun doing these videos. It's good for us, and we're glad to connect with you guys too. So it's really neat. All right, so it's 10:31 here, 10:31 Central Daylight Time. So we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to flip my screen around, and I'm going to try and show us my display on my computer. Like I said, we're going to do this over the phone today because we have a storm rolling through central Missouri here, and I thought it would be gone by now, but it's not. It just keeps swirling around and keeps coming back around. So we're going to do this over the phone, and I'm going to try and share my screen over the phone. So this should be fun. Anyway, I'm going to flip my screen around. We'll go ahead and get started. So today we want to talk about needles. And I know last time we were here, we talked a lot about those old sewing machines and domestic machines. And we're going to try and stay out of that today so much and just kind of focus on the long arm machine because, well, that's what we do here. So anyway, you can see, like in this frame right here, there is so many different sewing machine needles, and they're significantly different than the long arm needle. So we're gonna pop on over here. On our domestic machine, what we want to talk about is the difference between a long arm machine and a domestic machine and how it works. So on our domestic machine, we have feed dogs, and the fabric moves in a single direction, and the machine stitches in a straight line. And we have the feed dogs, we have the presser foot that comes down, and everything is moving in a straight line as it goes across here. Our long arm machine doesn't work like that at all. You know, when we're on our long arm machine, nothing actually stops. On our domestic machine, the hopper foot goes up, the feed dogs advance the material, the feed dogs come down, the hopper foot comes down, presser foot comes down, and you know, traps the material. Everything stops for an instant. The machine takes a stitch, and then the needle goes up and everything starts again. But in our long arm machine, nothing ever actually stops. You know, the head of the long arm machine is constantly moving. The machine never stops stitching, and so we need a completely different needle with our long arm machine than what we would use with our domestic machine, because it just works differently. So this is two views right here. This view right here is a typical domestic machine sewing, the domestic machine needle. And over here on the right is what an MR needle, a multi-range or a multi-rotational needle looks like. And this is our long arm needle over here. It's shaped completely different. The groove in the needle is shaped differently because we're stitching in different directions, as opposed to the, like I said, the domestic machine, which is always stitching in this direction. We could be stitching in any direction with our long arm. This is kind of what the shaft looks like. It's different in a lot of different respects. So I thought we would talk about that today, because there's a lot of misconceptions about needles and designations and what all this stuff means. So this is a label, and a lot of this I got from the Grossbeckert website. This is a typical label, and this is a frame cut from the Grossbeckert website that shows us what these designations mean. So all this stuff, it would be really interesting, or it is interesting, to go to the Grossbeckert website and just look at that. When you get in there, there's going to be, I realized that there were hundreds and hundreds of different kinds of needles and different kinds of points and different styles for different applications, and for leather and textiles and sewing bags together, and like feed sacks and just about anything that needs to be stitched, you know. So there's a lot of stuff on this website that really doesn't pertain to us a whole lot. So we're going to go right back over here, and we're going to look at the typical needle that we use in our Gamble machines. And this is the 134 MR needle. And this is a typical packaging, and this is the number 4 needle right here that we typically use. So we're going to talk about these numbers and these designations on this label for a minute, and hopefully that helps some people or clears up a little bit of confusion too. So this top number up here is a stock number or an item number. It's the item number for this 10 pack of screws, which that's what this 10 right here designates. I couldn't figure that out I was looking at all these numbers and I could not figure out what that 10 was for. And of course my wife says, well, Einstein, there's 10 needles in a pack. There's this designation over here is the needle size, and we'll talk about that in a minute. This is a metric designation. The 110 stands for 1.1 millimeter. The 18 is a wire gauge size, because here in the States, apparently we can't use the metric system. So this is a wire gauge size, 18. And number 4, the 4 is what we typically use, the designation we use as quilters generally. So the number 4 needle is our go-to needle generally in the Gamble machines. Our machines are set up for number 4 needle. This 134 MR is the needle style, I guess you say. I think Grossbeckert calls it the system, the needle system, but that's the style of needle. These other 2 designations under here, what they do is they usually put the top 3 designations for the same thing in here, just like they did up here, the metric size, the wire gauge size, and the US size. So this designation is the 134 MR. So that's the designation we generally use, but these are other systems right here. And they're designations for the same needle. All three of these are the same needle. And then we come down here, we have the R, the R point style. So, and the R stands for regular round point. And we'll talk about that here in a second too. So typically we look for the 134 MR needle, and the R, meaning round, means the tip of the needle is round. As it comes down to a point, it's still round, circular, as it's coming down to the point, but it is fairly sharp. The round is not to be confused with a ballpoint needle, and we'll talk about that in a second too. But the R designation is a fairly sharp needle, and it just seems to be the best go for long arm quilting. So most of our long arms use a 3.5 or 4 needle. The 4, like I said, is our standard go-to needle. The machine is set up for a number 4 needle, and I have to think that out of 100 quilts, we would probably use number 4 needles 95% of the time. Once in a while, if we're using a real fine thread or something that we're really trying to hide, we might go down to a 3 or a 3.5, 3.5 needle if we're using a very fine thread. Just trying to keep the holes poked down kind of a little bit smaller, and the thread size is a little bit smaller, and just to kind of hide the quilting sometimes, because on some quilts, you know, it's not about the quilting, but sometimes we want to hide the quilting and not take the attention away from the piecing itself, the quilt itself. So we do that occasionally, and we might use a lighter needle. You have to kind of be careful when you use a lighter needle. When you start getting down to 3.5 or 3.0 needles, the needles will deflect on you. They'll start to bend as we're stitching. So we have to remember, if we're going to use a number 3 or a 3.5 needle, we need to bring our stitch length down. We might have to kick it up to maybe 17 or 18 stitches per inch if we're going to use those finer needles, because those needles will deflect. They'll kind of bend a little bit as we're stitching because they're so much lighter. And what will happen is, especially if we're going from our belly bar back, the needle will bend away from the hook of the machine, and we'll start getting skip stitches if we start taking these great big stitches with fine thread and a fine needle. So we always want to remember that, keep that in mind, to tighten up your stitch length if you're using those finer needles. Occasionally we'll use a 4.5 or a 5. Usually the reason I would kick a needle size up is if I just couldn't get the stitch quality quite the way I would like it for some reason or another. You know, every quilt is different. The fabrics are different. The backing's different. A lot of times the batting inside is different. It's pieced differently, and every quilt is different, and it just behaves just a little bit differently. So a lot of times that's a real quick thing that you can do is take your number 4 needle out, put a 4.5 in there, and kick your needle size up. Maybe change the angle on it just a little bit, and we'll talk about that too here in a minute. And see if that doesn't improve our stitch quality. It can make a significant difference. There's some very heavy quilts with denim and seams and parts of Levi jackets and stuff like that, and sometimes we'll put a very heavy, very strong thread and a number 5 needle in the machine and just quilt it out. So there's different reasons for using different sizes of needles, and I think we should be aware of that. You should probably keep some other sizes on hand. You know, I would keep 3.5s, 4.5s, and 5s around, maybe even some 3s around occasionally, and just try it out. You know, it's a lot of fun. It makes a big difference on how our machine performs. So this is the needle size. This is what like the number 4 means right here. The needle size is the size of the shaft going back down. And it also kind of makes the difference in the scarf of the needle, how the needle and the relationship between the scarf of the needle and the hook work together. So it's actually set up with the number 4 needle, and it really works the best with the number 4 needle. The point style. So we talked about that just a little bit too. The R point is a round point. It's meaning that this part right here is circular, but the point itself is a regular point. So it comes down to a pretty sharp, kind of a chiseled shaped point, and it seems to work the best for quilting. Almost all the time. We use an R point needle almost exclusively. It seems like it goes through the quilt really quick. It goes right straight through the fabric and picks up the bobbin thread, comes right straight back out really quick. So it seems to work the best in probably 98% of the applications that we use. So this is pretty much what it looks like, and we got this from the Grossbecker website also. These designations up here, I didn't realize how many different designations and how many different point styles. There's needles on there that come down with a square point. They come down to a 4-sided chisel kind of point. There's points on there that cut this way. There's points that cut like decorative holes in leather, and there are all these various designations, so it's kind of confusing sometimes. But this is our point needle, and you see that it comes down in this shape right here, and then it comes down and it's fairly sharp at the end. Now, I want to talk about this FFG needle because a lot of us, we have these are around. A lot of us, they came with the machines. These needles are made for knits, and I know a lot of times we have t-shirt quilts and quilts memory quilts that have all different kinds of knits and everything in them, but generally, almost always, the R point needle seems to work the best because it's not like we're actually sewing these knits like you would on a domestic machine or in an application at a factory where you're putting fabric together. And most of the time, these knits have an interfacing on the back, right? So they're backed up. And the R point needle still seems to work the best with these kind of knits and everything. Most of the time when you see these FFG needles around quilting machines, they'll be these titanium needles, and they'll have this gold on them like it shows in here. Grossbecker has this GEBDER. I'm not sure what that is, if that's German or if that's an acronym for something, but it's a titanium coating that goes on that needle. So not only does it have this hard titanium coating on this needle is also very sharp. So our standard 134 MR, which is this chrome-plated needle over here, is just a little bit softer. And if we hit something, if we hit a button or we hit a high seam or something like that, a lot of times this needle will bend a little bit, but it usually doesn't break. Usually it bends and it hits the hopper foot. They will break, of course, but usually it'll take a lot to break a standard needle. However, these titanium needles, these gold colored needles, are made out of a much harder material, and their job actually is to stay sharp and to stay straight a long time, which they do. However, that hardness also makes those needles brittle, and they do break a lot easier, and when they break jagged. And ask me how I know. I've broken 2 of them, and it's not good. The end of the needle breaks jagged, and it will chop up a quilt top just as quick as a cat. Very, very seldom will I use an FFG needle anymore. Once in a while, occasionally, there'll be a quilt that has like a digitally printed fabric in it, and sometimes that fabric will kind of get little like white runs, like it's black digitally printed on a white fabric, and you'll get these little white runs in the fabric if you stitch it with well, any needle. But if you put sometimes if you put a FFG needle in it helps a little bit. It doesn't seem to help a whole lot, but occasionally I'll try that with an FFG needle. But for the most part, I just avoid them altogether. It seems like almost all the time the R-point needle is your best bet. So when we're replacing the needle, of course, we want to make sure that we get it in right. The bump of the needle, the scarf of the needle is actually the inside. Back over on this side, the bump of the needle, we want the bump of the needle coming back out towards us, and we want the groove of the needle in the front. And this is a illustration, of course, but our needles have a nice big deep groove going down the front of the needle to protect the thread, like we looked at in some of those earlier illustrations, and it seems to work out really well. So when we're replacing the needle, we want to be sure that the needle's pushed all the way up into the top. And our Gamble machines will have this little sight hole right here that we can look in and make sure that that needle is indeed seated all the way up. If we don't get our needle seated all the way up inside our needle bar, it would be no different than our needle bar being out of adjustment. It's critical that that needle is seated all the way up inside our needle bar so that when it comes down, it catches the hook at exactly the right time. So we need to watch for that. We also need to make sure that we don't have any lint packed up inside this hole. So every once in a while, maybe like every 4 or 5 needle changes, I'll stick the point of the old needle up in there and just make sure that there's nothing up inside that seat there. So when we're replacing the needle, generally we put the needle in there straight, almost straight. Sometimes we'll use a needle magnet right here on the front of our needle, and this little needle magnet, little needle alignment magnet, sticks to the groove of the needle, the groove in the front of the needle, and it tells us exactly which way the needle is aligned in our machine. And that makes a difference too, because we're stitching in different directions, and sometimes just kicking that needle out just a little bit, maybe a few degrees, 4 or 5 degrees one way or another, can make a big difference in how our machine is stitching. We talk about, like in this illustration right here, the kick the needle over just a little bit, so it's at just a little bit of an angle, or aimed at the cone holder on the left side of our machine back there, and it can make a big difference on some patterns. Typically, this is my go-to position right here when we start a quilt. This is typically about how I position my needle, with just a little bit of kick on it, because it seems to keep the thread on the same side of the needle most of the time, and it keeps it from jumping back and forth from the left side to the right side of the needle. And it just seems to stitch just a little bit better. Our stitch quality just seems to be a little bit better if we just have that little bit of kick on our needle. So that's pretty much what I wanted to talk about today. I know I want to show you something. If our internet is still up here, go to the Growth Speckered website and check it out. There's a lot of really cool information in there. There's some neat animations that show you how the machine works, how the needle comes down and the hook carries back around and carries our top thread around the bobbin and picks it up and brings it back. It's really neat, you know, and our quilting machines work much the same way as this machine is working in this illustration, except that we just don't have the feed dogs and it's just stitching with a standard hopper foot. So I'm going to turn this back around. So I really enjoyed doing this today. I'll stick around for a little bit. We'll try and answer any questions or any comments that you guys have. It's been a lot of fun on a rainy day here in Missouri, and we hope you guys have a good day. Thanks a lot. I'm going to take this phone down and then we'll see so I can read the comments here. That didn't work. All right, guys, we're going to sign off here. You guys have a good day. Bye-bye.